The restaurant was all mirrors and candles, a room that seemed to applaud itself with every flicker of light. I arrived at 6:15 p.m. in a simple black dress that had seen more Sunday mornings than cocktail hours, clutching a photo album wrapped in brown paper and kitchen twine. It was my son's 40th birthday dinner, or so the gold-lettered invitation had promised. Though the moment I stepped inside, I felt like a misprint in someone else's story. A hostess with a smile sharpened to a point slid her eyes over me as if scanning for a barcode that wasn't there, then pointed toward a long table blooming with lilies and laughter. I saw my boy, once my small Daniel, now Daniel Hart in a suit cut close to the bone, throw his head back and laugh with men who wore watches I could not afford to admire. His wife, Vanessa, glittered at his shoulder, a champagne flute singing invisibly between her fingers. Nobody noticed me at first. I found the far end of the table, a hushed step away from the center where the toasts would live, and set the album by a plate rimmed in gold. A waiter drifted past 3 times without leaving a glass of water. I folded my hands in my lap like prayer, listening to the ice of other people's conversations clink and settle. The room smelled like lemon and money and polished stone. I told myself to breathe, not to cry, not to blink too quickly, not to feel the way I felt like a winter coat hung in a summer closet. When Daniel finally turned, his smile fell the way a stage curtain falls when the show is over, quick and complete. "Oh, Mom," he said, as if the surprise of me had curdled the air. He didn't reach for me. He glanced from my shoes to my hair, the way you check an old teapot for a crack before pouring. I put the album into his hands and said happy birthday. He set it down like it was heavier than it looked. Vanessa floated close with a smile that couldn't find the floor. "That purse is interesting," she murmured, stroking the word interesting until it sounded like a bruise. I nodded. "It carries what I need." Around us, the room gleamed, and I remembered smaller rooms, our kitchen when Daniel was 9. Eggs sizzling at 6:30 a.m. The grocery store where I worked till 4 p.m., then walked to my second job at 5 p.m. The soles of my shoes learning every nail in the sidewalk. I remembered the year I sold my wedding ring to buy his school books. The way the pawn shop bell rang like a door that would never open again. I remembered the winter I wore the same coat for 6 seasons and learned how to turn bones and almost old carrots into soup that tasted like hope. The memories came like small birds and sat on my shoulder, trying to warm me. At 8 p.m., the toasts began. Daniel thanked colleagues with the sort of charm a person learns when they realize charm is currency. He thanked Vanessa, and Vanessa's parents, and his mentors, and a list of names that sounded like streets in a rich neighborhood. My name never arrived. I waited for it the way a person waits for the bus in the rain, telling myself the headlights in the distance are surely the route I need. They weren't. When the applause quieted, I tapped my spoon against my glass. Once, twice. A gentle bell of a sound. I just wanted to say, I began. But Daniel's voice cut cleaner than a knife. "Mom," he said, loud enough that the table pivoted. "Please don't. You're embarrassing everyone." The laugh that followed was soft and mean as a feather dipped in acid. A woman with nails like little moons leaned into her friend and whispered behind a hand, and both of them giggled at my thrift store purse. I stood there, my mouth open and my hand half raised, and the part of me that had once believed I would always be his soft place to land folded itself into a smaller room. He leaned back and said, almost lazily, "She's too poor to sit with us anyway." There it was. The sentence fell through me like a stone into a well. and I watched the rings ripple out into the years. I could have shattered. Instead, I reached for the one thing I still owned: my quiet. I lowered my spoon. I sat down. I waited for the room to remember itself. Then my phone rang. A number I did not know. Answer. Something inside me said. So I did. Mrs. Eleanor Hart. A pleasant voice asked, Eleanor being me. On paper and in prayer. We're calling to confirm that your online business has officially closed at the purchase price we agreed upon. Congratulations. The transfer of funds, $45 million, has cleared. Every fork paused midair. A wineglass stopped just shy of a mouth. A candle's reflection held perfectly still in the silverware. I said thank you. Please send the documents to my attorney. And slipped the phone back into my purse. I looked at Daniel, and he looked at me as if the room had tilted. I stood. Not to make a scene, but because my feet had remembered the road home. I took the brown papered album the way a mother takes a sleeping child from a car seat. The room followed me with its eyes. 45 million. Someone breathed, as if the words were rare birds. I did not smile to wound anyone. I smiled because Worth recognized its own pulse again. When the heavy glass door closed behind me and the night air touched my face, I knew what had happened. I had stopped begging for a seat at a table I had not built. I did not plan an empire. I planned a life that would not collapse when the phone stopped ringing. After Daniel married and drifted into a constellation I could no longer name. The house sounded like an instrument I had forgotten how to play. In those first months, I murmured to the walls, to the teapot, to the small basil plant by the window that reached for 8:30 a.m. light. Work kept me upright. The grocery store still needed my hands at 7 a.m. The office cleaning crew still clocked me in at 6 p.m. But the hours between belonged to a quiet so large I could hear the hinge of it. I had always been decent with numbers, the kind of woman who could make rent from lint and a plan. So I started helping a florist down the street balance her books. It turned into a small circle of businesses: Mr. Patel's repair shop, a bakery that smelled like Sunday, a seamstress who hummed to her scissors. I charged a fair rate and brought the same discipline I had used to boil bones into broth: use everything, waste nothing, label the jars. On a Monday at 9 a.m., the florist's daughter showed me how to make a website for her prom corsages. The screen breathed color. I was old enough to be the internet's grandmother and young enough to be curious. I watched videos late at night about selling online, how to photograph objects in a way that made them tell the truth about themselves, how to describe a teacup so a woman in another country would feel the echo of its weight in her palm. I filled notebooks with sketches of pages. I saved a portion of every invoice in an envelope marked someday. When someday had enough to look like courage, I bought 3 small lights, a used camera, and a second-hand laptop that hummed like a cat. I started with what I knew would not lie: things made carefully. Things that carried stories. Vintage linens, hand-stitched aprons, teacups that had learned other people's conversations and still listened. I learned how to ship calmly, to wrap breakables as if they were bones in winter. I learned how to answer questions from women who wanted to send a gift to their sister in a place where the magnolias bloomed at 5 p.m. on summer evenings. Orders came like slow rain, then like steady rain, then like a weather pattern. A retired nurse named May, who liked to wake at 5:30 a.m. and garden as the sun elbowed its way over the world, emailed me to say she cried when she opened a package because the ribbon smelled faintly of lavender, and her mother had loved lavender. I cried too. I hired May part-time to help source pieces at estate sales. She brought a thermos of tea and a tape measure and a new kind of laughter to my kitchen. Then a friend of May's, and then the seamstress's cousin. And soon we were a small, stubborn constellation of women who had learned to stretch paychecks into parachutes. We worked at my oak table, wrapping and labeling and telling stories. I built a set of principles the way you build a fence that keeps the wolves out and the strawberries in. Every listing must be honest about flaws. Every customer must feel seen. Every piece must be worth the room it occupies in a person's life. And one more, if you don't know. Learn. So I learned. I learned how to track inventory without losing my mind. How to price so that generosity didn't bankrupt us and greed didn't sour us. How to run targeted ads at 7:45 a.m. for women who searched for heirloom gifts while their coffee cooled. At first, our profits were small, the kind that make you proud and nervous. Then a national magazine wrote a short paragraph about us in an article about grandmothers of the internet, and the orders surged like the tide finding a new moon. Our little business doubled, then doubled again. I kept my church dress and my thrift store purse and my long habit of listening, and I kept our ship steady. I learned to say no to investment offers that felt like strings curled behind a smile. I said yes to a quiet line of products we could make ourselves hand-mended quilts. Aprons with pockets deep enough to carry an afternoon. Wooden spoons sanded to a finish that felt like remembering. The team swelled to 7 women, then 11. We overpaid a carpenter named Luis, whose wife, Alma, ran the bakery to build shelves from salvaged wood, and he knocked on my door at 7 a.m. with sawdust in his hair and plans he'd drawn on the back of his electric bill. I paid on time. I made coffee. We took care of each other. Then a company with a cheerful name and an unblinking smile came courting. Their offer looked like a meadow of sunlight, but I smelled the shade. I thanked them kindly and declined. The second offer came 2 years later, from a quiet firm led by a woman who listened more than she spoke. She asked about our packing table and our lavender ribbon, about May's garden and Luis's grown daughter who wanted to learn bookkeeping, about our insistence that every piece deserve a place at someone's table. She asked what I wanted life to feel like at 7 p.m. and at 7 a.m. I said steady. I said honest. I said useful. She nodded and brought me an offer that felt like a door opening onto a farmhouse porch. I took my time, asked my attorney to read every line, made sure every woman who had worked with me would receive a slice of the sun. When the call came to confirm the transfer, $45 million paid for a life built slowly, and well, it rang in a restaurant full of lilies and laughter that had thought I was wearing the wrong story. The night of the dinner did not end when the door sighed shut behind me. I stood on the sidewalk breathing ordinary air and looking up at windows where people ate invisible portions of status with their steak. I hailed a cab the way I used to hail hope. Hand steady, eyes kind. The driver was an old man with a knit cap and a radio humming a song I had danced to once when Daniel was 6 and the kitchen linoleum was moonlight. Long night, he asked, and I said, long enough to become new. I slept that night as if a locksmith had finally arrived for the worry in my chest. Morning came at 6 a.m. like a polite knock. I made tea and fed the basil plant, then drove to May's house with a spool of lavender ribbon and a secret I needed to hold in the light with someone who would not ask for it. May had dirt under her nails and joy in her pockets. We sat on her back steps at 8 a.m., our knees touching like old friends. And I told her about the offer and the clauses and the protections and the way the people at that table had laughed until the number unlaughed them. She shook her head and said the thing I have stitched into my bones. People always recognize a crown if it's made of cash. Harder to see the crown made of consistency. We talked for an hour. Then I drove to the warehouse to tell the team. I wanted them to hear it from my mouth and feel it with their hands. I laid out the plan, the sale, the guarantees for the brand's values, the commitments to our suppliers, the distribution to each woman based on months of work and months of faith. When I said the words, $45 million, Alma gasped the way you do when you see the ocean for the first time and realize it has been living where you could not see it. We cried the kind of crying that washes the face and leaves the heart clean. I signed papers at 2 p.m. with a pen that had no magic in it beyond ink and intention. I asked the lawyer to read aloud the clause that protected our lavender ribbon. He laughed, but read it, and then we were done. I had become the sort of woman who could be measured in zeros, but preferred to be measured in recipes and names. I knew what would happen next. People who had not called in years would remember how to dial. People who had ridiculed thrift would learn the word legacy. I rehearsed the sentence I would need, and I polished it to a calm shine no. Thank you. That evening, just after 7 p.m., my phone flashed Daniel's name, and memory tugged at me like a tugboat. For a second, I saw the boy who had used my shoulder as a pillow on the city bus when we couldn't afford a taxi. The boy who made a robot from cereal boxes and asked me to clap for him like the moon had hired me to. I answered. He apologized in a voice that sounded borrowed from a better man, then drifted like fog toward his point. A new business. An investment. It could be profitable for both of us. I said the sentence I had practiced. Soft as a coat, son. You didn't want me as your mother last night. Please don't ask me to be your banker today. Silence held, and in it I could hear the season changing. He tried again, saying he was nervous, saying the room made him cruel, saying he wanted to reconnect. Connection. I have learned, is a bridge with two architects. I hope your project succeeds. I told him. And then I ended the call not to punish him, but to protect the part of me that had finally stopped auditioning for a role I had already lived. When the phone sat quiet, I made a small dinner toast and jam from Alma's bakery. A soft egg, tea that tasted like evenings in June. I ate on the back steps and listened to the neighborhood argue and reconcile with itself. A dog barked and then forgot why. Someone practiced the piano at 8:30 p.m. A child declared that baths were tyranny and then surrendered to bubbles. I slept again, and in the morning, 6 a.m. again. Faithful as bread, I opened the notebooks that had built the business and wrote a list titled After. After would include scholarships for girls who were good with their hands and told they should aim only for screens. After would include a fund for women leaving marriages with nothing but a duffel bag and a spine. After would include a new roof for the church that had fed us when Daniel was 7, and I was learning how to put hunger on a schedule. After, as it turns out, is another word for harvest. Days passed. The media found us and called our story tidy little names Grandmapreneur. Overnight success as if nights did not exist. As if the years between 5 a.m. buses and midnight bookkeeping had been a nap. I smiled and corrected them when I had the energy. When I didn't, I went out to May's garden and let the marigolds do the talking. Vanessa called once. Her voice carried the sugar of desperation, which is always a little grainy. She said she admired me for keeping secrets. She said she wanted to learn from me. She said we were family, weren't we? Then she said they were looking at a new house, more rooms. Better views, and perhaps I would like to see it before I helped. I told her she should pick a home that fit her heart instead of her envy. I told her I was not investing in the man who had asked me to sit small. The quiet on the line had the shape of a mirror. She filled it with a noise that wanted to be laughter and then hung up. The next call came from a woman named Jessa, who ran a shelter's transitional housing program. She had seen the article that got more details wrong than right. But the part about our lavender ribbon was true. She asked if we might meet. At 10 a.m. the next day, I visited the shelter. The hallway smelled like bleach and hope. Women sat at tables filling out forms that felt like border crossings. Jessa walked me through a room where sewing machines waited like patient animals. "We're teaching skills," she said, "but we need a pipeline to purpose." I looked at the machines and saw a future I could trust. We built a pilot together. We would design a limited run of mended quilts and aprons, teach the work with dignity, pay well, cover childcare, and promise that no piece would ship unless it was good enough to sit at my own table. I asked May to help me draft the curriculum. She wept on the phone and said she had been waiting her whole life to be asked for a map she already knew how to draw. The first class met at 8 a.m. on a Monday. The room had the beginning of the school year smell, even though the students were grown women who had been out of school longer than the fresh paint had been alive. We laid our hands on fabric as if it could hear us. By noon, the rhythm of machines made a hum that sounded like forgiveness. By 2 p.m., the shelter's break room had become a little town of conversation recipes and jokes and the soft-edged gossip that plants friendships instead of poisoning them. At 4 p.m., I drove home beneath a sky that looked like someone had ironed it. My phone buzzed a voicemail from Daniel. He said he wanted to stop by. I sat in the car until the message played twice. Because there are days when a mother must practice how to be a woman first. I called him back and said yes. 7 p.m. when he arrived. He hesitated at my door like it might test him. Inside, he said the house seemed smaller than he remembered. I said it had learned to fit me just right. We sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the photo album I had set there like a primer. He flipped a page, stopped at a picture of him holding a blue ribbon at 10, and smiled despite himself. We did it. Mom, he had said then, his grin wider than the world. I waited for him to find that boy inside his face. He cleared his throat. He said he had been unkind. He said he had been performing for a room that did not deserve a performance. He said other things that were true adjacent. Son, I said, do you remember the winter your boots had holes and I lined them with plastic bags and you said it felt like wearing boats? Do you remember the nurse at the clinic who gave us an extra sample of cough syrup and wrote down a soup recipe on the back of a receipt? Do you remember how the bus driver waited an extra minute at 6:40 a.m. when the snow was lopsided and we were still running? He pinched the bridge of his nose. He said he remembered. I told him a thing I had learned too late. When people believe their value is an outfit, they start mistaking mirrors for friends. I am not a mirror, I said. I am the person who kept the light on when you were afraid of the dark. And last night you told the room I was less than light. He exhaled. He apologized again, and I believed the part of him that was sincere. But I told him a boundary is a door with a lock you use, not a suggestion on a napkin. He asked if we could try again. I said yes, but not the kind of yes that yokes a woman to saving a man from his own reflection. You will come for tea at 4 p.m. on Sundays, I said. We will not talk about money. We will talk about weather and recipes and the women who make your life possible. You will call me before you plan to put me in a room. You will not ask me to be small so that you can be big. He nodded. The boy at 10 nodded from behind his adult face. We ate slices of Alma's almond cake and watched the street do its little opera of dogs and joggers. When he left, he hugged me, not for appearances, not for an audience, but because something old had unknotted and wanted to breathe. Sundays started to feel like a song I could hum again. Daniel arrived promptly at 4 p.m. with the practiced punctuality of someone who wanted to be seen trying. The first week, he brought peonies. The second week, he brought a screwdriver to fix the kitchen drawer that had stuck since Noah was building boats. We spoke of small things that mattered: the neighbor's new cat with half an ear, the tomatoes which had decided to be abundant this year as if to apologize for the last, the way the light pooled on the table at 5 p.m. in late summer, like honey deciding whether to be patient or spill. Vanessa did not join him at first. I did not ask. When she did appear one week, she wore flats and a sweater and a humility that fit like a costume but looked less uncomfortable than before. She offered to slice lemons for the tea, and I gave her a knife and a cutting board and enough air to be either sincere or not. People are not assignments. They are stories edited by time. Meanwhile, the program at the shelter grew legs and walked on. We launched the first collection, and it sold out in hours because people recognize sincerity even when it shows up in an apron. The women wrote their initials on a small tag sewn into the hem, just letters. But to me, those letters were as loud as trumpets. May kept the garden and the schedule. Luis built more shelves and claimed he had never seen a room so full of purpose with so few people yelling. We kept our rules the way you keep promises. On a Thursday, an article about us went viral, which is a modern way of saying strangers clapped in our direction. I read none of the comments and all of the emails. One came from a girl in her first semester of college who said her mother called her foolish for studying textile arts. She sent a photo of her hand holding a needle like a baton. I wrote back and told her that making beautiful, useful things is the opposite of foolish. It is a rebellion against emptiness. I sent her a scholarship check because I could, and because money is a language, and I wanted this sentence to be grammatically correct. The second offer to buy my story came from a man with glossy hair who opened with the words, "We can make you a brand." I told him I already was a person and hung up. The check from the sale sat mostly untouched in an account that made bankers smile. I made a plan for it that looked nothing like yachts. Endow the shelter program for 10 years. Fund a dental clinic on Saturdays at the church basement so no one would have to choose between a toothache and rent. Replace the playground at the park with the slide that had scratched Daniel's leg when he was 5. Paint the new one blue and name it after the janitor who had always mopped the monkey bars with pride. Money, used properly, is water. It should move. It should clean. It should find the lowest places and lift them up. One evening at 7 p.m., Daniel asked if I would ever tell the story of the dinner publicly. It would go viral, he said, and the words snagged on me like a burr. No, I said. That room does not deserve to be famous for having learned a lesson they didn't earn. He looked disappointed and then relieved, as if a sentence had been commuted. The next Sunday, he arrived without Vanessa, but with a question squirming under his jacket. "Mom," he said, and his voice made its choice to be honest. What would you have wanted me to say that night if I could go back? I surprised us both by answering simply, "Introduce me. Tell one true story about the person who taught you how to stand up. Thank her. Then sit down." He closed his eyes like he was practicing it for a room only he could see. A year is a stubborn animal. It will walk, whether you watch or not. Seasons unrolled their soft maps, and I kept marking Sundays at 4 p.m. with a pencil that did not tire. The shelter's second cohort began. A woman named Nita brought her son, Jamal, to our open house at 3 p.m. He wore a tie he had clearly tied by himself and told me he wanted to design sneakers that didn't make your feet feel like they were in jail. I introduced him to Luis, who laughed and said, "We will free the feet." And I believed him. The money continued to be water. I learned to say yes to the quiet requests and no to the ones that arrived in tuxedos. A cousin I had not seen since my wedding called to reminisce and then remember he needed a bridge loan. I told him the bridge was under construction and would be for the rest of my life. He sulked in a register only a grown man trying to be 12 can manage. Vanessa came to more Sundays and stood still long enough for honesty to find her. One week, she arrived early at 3:30 p.m. with a casserole I recognized from a recipe she could not have invented my late mother's, a dish I had cooked through lean winters. I asked Daniel, she said, and he wrote it down for me. We ate, and the casserole tasted less like apology and more like effort, and I decided effort could rent a room in my forgiveness. In the fall. The restaurant where the dinner had happened sent me an invitation to a charity gala. The envelope was thick as a secret. I almost tossed it into the bin with the flyers promising lawn care, but the logo caught me like a splinter. I opened it. The gala raised funds for a program teaching hospitality skills to teenagers. I turned the card over. On the back, in careful black pen, someone had written, "I was your waiter that night. I am sorry I did not offer you water until you asked. Will you come? If you do, I promise every guest will have a full glass by 6 p.m. Sincerely, Matteo." I went. Not to be seen, but to see. The dining room had the same mirrors and candles, but the light felt less convinced of itself. Matteo greeted me at the door. His face carried humility like a torch. The teenagers glowed with the nervous brightness of people who have not yet learned to perform their confidence. I watched them learn how to balance plates and attention, how to read a table without stealing themselves from it. Halfway through, a boy spilled a small river of water and looked as if he wanted to resign from being alive. Matteo touched his shoulder and said something gentle that I could not hear, and the boy tried again. I went home at 9 p.m. feeling like someone had returned a library book I thought was lost. The next morning, at 7 a.m., I wrote a check to their program large enough to buy patients in bulk and asked that they name nothing after me. They named the water pitchers Eleanor anyway. Sometimes the world insists on gratitude. I can live with that. Daniel's business failed. This is not a tragedy. It is a curriculum. He told me on a Wednesday at 6 p.m., standing in my kitchen with his hands open. He had mistakes to name and he named them, which is the only way mistakes agree to become teachers. I told him I would not fund the rescue, but I would feed the student. We ate soup that tasted like rain, deciding to be mercy. When he left, he hugged me long, and I felt something in him stop trying to be taller than it was. The day the paperwork finalized the shelter endowment, I walked to the park at 8 a.m. and sat on the new blue slide and looked ridiculous, which is sometimes the cost of joy. A little girl with a red beret asked if I was stuck, and I told her I was practicing. For what she asked, and I said, "For remembering." She nodded as if this made perfect sense, then showed me how to go faster if I lifted my feet. I lifted my feet. I went faster. At noon. I met with Jessa and May to map the next 5 years more cohorts. An apprenticeship track. Partnerships with small manufacturers who had forgotten that dignity scales better than margins. We plotted generosity like engineers. We argued over commas and laughed until our stomachs hurt. At 2 p.m., we walked through the sewing room and paused to watch Nita stitch a line so straight it could have been drawn by a ruler. She looked up and blushed. "It's just a hem," she said, and I said, "There is no such thing as just when you are holding a needle." Late that afternoon, Daniel arrived, and we sat on the porch as the day cooled. "I've been thinking about the things I didn't thank you for," he said. He began to list them, but I held up a hand. "Make something," I said, "something that outlasts your list." He nodded. Weeks later, he took a job teaching financial literacy at the community center 2 evenings a week, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m., which is the hour Hope likes to park its car and come inside. He told stories about compound interest using jars of marbles and explained budgets like recipes instead of punishments. The teenagers listened. Some of them rolled their eyes right on schedule. But when they returned the next week, they sat closer. "I went to a session once and sat in the back like a spy," he said. "You are more than what you can buy." And I thought, who taught you that? And then I remembered I did, when we counted pennies at the kitchen table and built paper boats from overdue notices so we could laugh while we learned. On a Sunday in early winter, Vanessa arrived at 4 p.m. with a book of baby names hidden in a grocery bag. She placed it on the table without fanfare. I let the book sit there like a cat deciding whether to hurt us with love. We talked about ordinary things, the way winter smells like metal, the way bread needs patience but rewards it, the way mornings refuse to apologize for being themselves. As they left, she squeezed my hand the way a person squeezes a bridge to see if it will hold. It did. The evening found me at the kitchen sink washing teacups, while the streetlight did its good work of making darkness honest. I remembered the dinner, the laughter sharp and careless, the words too poor to sit with us, and I tried them on again. They no longer fit. They hung like a coat 2 sizes too big. All shape and no truth. The truth was simpler. I had spent years mistaking the absence of applause for the absence of worth. Worth does not clap. Worth keeps the heat on, and the soup simmering, and the ledger balanced, and the lavender ribbon tied well. Worth learns new tools at 60 and 70 and calls that learning joy. Worth refuses to weaponize wealth and refuses to be erased by rooms where money is the only language spoken. The next morning, at 6 a.m., I wrote a letter to the person I had been on the night of the dinner. I told her she had done the bravest thing a person can do, stayed herself. I told her the phone call did not give her value. It revealed it to people who had been trained not to see. I folded the letter and put it in the photo album under the picture of Daniel at 10, blue ribbon in his hand. Both of our faces turned toward a future we could not name yet. I never returned to that table as a guest of the people who had laughed. I returned only in the ghost light of memory. Not to haunt, but to harvest. The harvest was this: I had tried for too long to be a sentence in Daniel's story. In the end, I learned to be the author of my own. The money changed many things because money always changes many things. It is a tool loud enough to be heard in rooms where compassion whispers, but it did not change what mattered. What mattered was daily tea at 7 a.m. Basil watered, hands that knew how to mend, a back porch where sunsets performed their slow opera without asking for tips. What mattered was the Sunday rule and how we kept it, and the way keeping it taught Daniel to keep other things. Like promises to teenagers and the way his voice softened when he said, "Mom." When the baby came in spring at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. They named her Grace, and the name lay on her small chest like sunlight. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa and I sat together often, both of us learning how to be new kinds of women. She asked for recipes, and I gave them. She offered to help with packages, and I accepted. We practiced the choreography of family without tripping. I walked Grace in the afternoon and told her the names of flowers and women she would never meet who had bent the world slightly so she could walk in it unharmed more often than not. When she slept, I whispered into the soft cave of her ear, "You do not need to be impressive. You only need to be kind and stubborn in the direction of good." Once, at a farmer's market at 10 a.m., a woman stopped me to say she had heard my story and cried, and then wrote a business plan. She asked how to keep going when no one clapped. I told her to find a May, to find a Louise, to find a Jessa, to build a table to work at and not to sit at, to wrap every package as if it were traveling to someone who needed proof that care is real. I told her to let her work make a sound she could live with. At home. The basil went to seed and I saved it, because that is another way to say future. On the anniversary of the dinner, I made myself a simple meal and set a plate at the seat where I had once been invisible. I poured water into my glass and watched it bloom to the brim. I raised the glass to the empty chair and said aloud, "I always was, not richest, not rightest, not most, not best, whole." Later that night, I took the album down from the shelf and opened to the last page where the letter rested. I added a line. It said, "You built a table. People eat at it now. That is enough." The lesson. If there needs to be one that fits in a pocket, is this build quietly? Keep your word. Let money be water and not fire. And should a room mistake you for less, don't waste your breath on weather vanes. Find the wind and move. If someone you love loses themselves in weather, offer them a coat and a map. But do not climb into their storm just to prove you care. Love knows how to wait on the porch with the light on. I do not know what rooms you will be asked to enter. What tables will make you feel like a misprint. I know this, your worth is not a chair you must beg to occupy. It is the floor beneath everything. If the people you love cannot or will not see, let your life make a sound they cannot ignore. The clean whistle of a kettle at 8 a.m., the scissors' soft snick through fabric, the slide of a needle finding its way through the stubborn corners. When they finally turn to look, you will be busy living. If you have been pushed aside by those who should have pulled you close, take it from a woman who once folded herself small to fit into a room that was never built for her. Stop knocking. Build, then open your door wide. Like what you heard if this story moved you. Please like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what quiet thing you're building next.